May be seated. In our second reading from the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, it ends with a very well-known phrase, Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That, along with these readings from Isaiah and then the Gospel, the Passion according to Mark, all very familiar. And certainly everything we do starting today through Easter Sunday, familiar. The Palm Sunday commemoration of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and then as you are able and as you choose, taking part in the Holy Thursday Mass, then the Friday Liturgy of the Word, remembering Jesus' death on the cross, Easter Vigil, and then Easter Sunday, all those so familiar. It's my hope that passing on to you some things I have learned just this week, things I'd never heard, and I've already begun to be helpful to give a fresh perspective on all that we're doing. Might do the same for you. So I want to share with you some things that I've learned through a presentation on tying the Eucharist to its Jewish roots. One of the things that we might miss, if you don't already know these things about the Jewish Passover, that what we call the Last Supper, I think everybody knows this, that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. But by the time we've gotten to this, it's been several days since what we call Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which we commemorated by I read the Gospel of John, his version of that. It's very easy to see, as it says in Philippians, how those Jewish people saw Jesus' glory. It's easy to see him glorified and upheld by all that happened on what we call Palm Sunday. John even points out that the great crowd who had come for the feast heard that Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, and so they arranged to welcome him as he came into the city. Well, how great, how big, how large was that crowd? One of the most well-known Jewish historians contemporary to Jesus' time and writing about the life in Israel and in Jerusalem in particular, Josephus, his writings indicate that on any given Passover once a year, there could be up to 2 million people descending upon Jerusalem. Because at that time, the only proper way to celebrate the Passover meal was to come to Jerusalem and do it there in the city and have each group's lamb for the Passover sacrificed at the temple. And the groups were meant to be at least 10 and at most 20. So Josephus points out that for the Passover celebration, for the devout Jewish people, there were more than 200,600 lambs that had to be sacrificed. And one of those, this particular Passover, would have been the Passover lamb that Jesus and the apostles used. Well, how would they have gotten this lamb? Well, one thing that I know I never thought of this until I heard this presentation is that when Jesus picks out these two disciples, which in John's gospel it's specified as Peter and John, when he says, "Go and prepare the Passover for me," through this secret rendezvous that Jesus apparently has organized, part of what they did would not just be going to that room and finding out where it was and getting it set up for the meal. It most likely meant that Peter and John were the ones who would have taken the lamb that would have been for what we call the Last Supper and taking it to the temple and getting in these groups that took 2 hours of 3 shifts of sacrificing the lambs there. So once they did that, and I'll return to that image in a bit, but once they would have taken this lamb to be sacrificed at the altar and its blood drained out there at the temple, then they would have gone to set up the rest of the meal and the room and everything else for Jesus and the other apostles. And some speculate that the reason Jesus only told those 2 apostles where to find this room, so that it wouldn't be till the last minute that the rest of them would know where it was, is that the Jewish leaders are looking for a way to kill Jesus, to arrest him at least, and probably they were planning to hope to kill him. And, what we call Palm Sunday, who knows how many out of, let's say there was 2 million people in Jerusalem, how many of those 2 million might have been there welcoming Jesus in on that Sunday into Jerusalem? So the leaders would have seen this huge crowd, right? Even a small percentage of 2 million people is a huge crowd, would have seen them adoring Jesus, worshiping him, welcoming him. So they would be concerned that at least those people might indeed start a riot if they saw the leaders arresting Jesus. That's why they were afraid, because they had seen all this adulation that Jesus had received. But Jesus himself might also have been saying to himself, I need to keep this secret, particularly from Judas, of where we're going to have this Passover. Because the earlier Judas might know where they're going to be, the earlier he might then betray Jesus to the leaders. But once they got there, one element of a Jewish Passover was that there were 4 cups that were involved in the ceremony. And what we have here in Mark's gospel, in what we recognize as the institution of the Eucharist, this cup that Jesus offers up and says to them to drink actually would have been the 3rd cup in the ceremony. So they would expect there'd be a 4th cup after the meal. So when Jesus says, I will not drink the fruit of the vine again until I drink it new in the kingdom of God, the apostles might have been a bit surprised, because it appears that Jesus was violating and breaking the regulations, as it were, or the approach for the Passover. Because they would say, wait, there's supposed to be 1 more cup. How can he say he's not going to drink the fruit of the vine again? So just throw that away. They might have been puzzled by that, and it might appear that Jesus was violating the Passover meal. So, and I will say, give credit to, this is things that I've just learned. This is not direct primary research of my own. Okay, this is suggestions from a Catholic professor whose presentation I've watched twice, actually, this week. So then we get to the crucifixion, the Passion and the crucifixion. And Jesus is there, and it says, they gave him wine drugged with myrrh, but he did not take it. He had just said, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until I drink it new in the kingdom of God. This wine drugged with myrrh was a custom to give people who were to be tortured and executed something to numb their pain. So a bit of a humanitarian gesture, but Jesus refuses it. But notice later, and so notice how it gives this detail, that he did not take that offer of wine given to him. But then later, as we just heard, after he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And has endured all this mocking and is about to die, it says, one of them ran, soaked a sponge with wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. From what I understand, if not in Mark's gospel, and at least perhaps John's gospel, but in one of the gospels, this verb is different than just giving something to somebody. But apparently the verb was caused him to drink in Greek. So it would indicate, and also since Mark does not say that Jesus refused this wine, it would appear, at least you could infer, that Jesus did, in fact, drink some of this wine. Because he sees and he knows that he is about to die, and his death inaugurates the kingdom of God in a new way. So he can drink this wine as if it was the fourth cup of the Passover meal he had started with the apostles, fulfilling and transforming the Jewish custom and bringing in God's kingdom in a particular way. This is his glory. This is his being raised up on high. Not what happened on Palm Sunday. That was just mere human glory. But here, as Paul wrote in Philippians, God raised him high. He accepted death on a cross, so God has raised him high. This is his glory. He transformed the ultimate suffering of mocking, torture, execution, unjustly accused, to be the glory of the outbreak of the kingdom. In the prayers that I've spoken already at the beginning of Mass for the commemoration of Palm Sunday and the entrance into Jerusalem, there were phrases that spoke of us sharing in his suffering so as to share in his glory and his resurrection. So the first thing I want to offer to you to consider, to pray about this Holy Week, to perhaps make this a fresh Holy Week, something new for God to move in your hearts and your minds, to fight the familiarity, is as Jesus has taken and transformed the Passover meal, as he's taken and transformed the suffering and the torture and the death to be the outbreak of God's kingdom, let us bring to God our heartbreaks, our suffering, our afflictions, our difficulties and struggles, and ask Jesus, as he struggled and would have been so tortured, that he might take those things of our lives and transform them to be part of the outbreak and the continued spread of God's kingdom. His fourth cup is the cup of suffering, as well as literally the wine that he took on the cross. And then another insight about the Jewish customs and the Passover in particular. Back to the temple and the sacrifice of these lambs. 200,000 plus lambs sacrificed in the temple over what appears to be about a 2-hour time period. And all that blood for the ceremonial symbol rooted in Exodus would have been poured over and in front of the altar there in the temple in Jerusalem. And there is evidence that in that temple, which Solomon would have built, under the altar, understandably, there was a drain and a system of pipes to drain all that blood away. And Solomon had built underneath the temple a system of reservoirs and more pipes and aqueducts leading out of apparently the southwest side of the temple. So that when this blood, all this blood of all these lambs would go down that drain and through those pipes, it would meet with this water, this reservoir, this aqueduct under that, and that is what would flow out of the side of the temple. So that any Jewish or anybody, not just a Jewish person, anybody walking past that corner of the temple on Passover would see from the side of the temple blood and water flowing from the temple. And so some suggest that, as we will hear on Good Friday, or if you read it yourself, John's Passion, I think you all know or see where this is going. John has that detail that after Jesus' death, one of the soldiers pierces his side, and out of his side blood and water flow. He is the temple in all its glory. His heart is like the altar in the temple of Jerusalem. For the Jewish people, they saw the temple in Jerusalem as the ultimate place where heaven and earth met, where God came to be with his people, and where God's people came to be with God. And Jesus is that new temple. He is that place where heaven and earth meet, fully divine and fully human, showing us God's justice, God's righteousness, God's challenging call to us to be purified and to resist sin and to become holier, and a place to meet God's mercy and love. As blood and water flowed from the temple of the sacrificed lambs, so the blood and water flowed from Jesus' heart to not just then, 2,000 years ago, but a continuous flow of God's love and mercy for each of us. I invite us all during this Holy Week to ask God somehow to work in some new, powerful, fresh way in your life, that love and mercy flowing from the side of Christ, symbolized by the blood and water, may enrich our observation and prayer of Holy Week and enhance our entering fully into the glory of Jesus Christ the Lord in our upcoming celebration of his resurrection on Easter.